the correct story way and problem with one Brodie's naturalistic view. So, Brian Hales.
I really appreciate the opportunity to be with you today. It's an honor to be able to address this group. I have a lot of people who ask me, Brian, why are you so interested with polygamy? And then I have other people who ask me, Brian, why are you so interested in the word? And to this last group, I just say I can't monologue very well, so you don't need to worry about me trying to public. There is a reason that I'm involved with this study, and it's because a member of my family was excommunicated in 1989 for joining a polygamy group. 3 years later, I got with Max Anderson, and we wrote this book. I did all of the writing, but he's the expert on Mormon fundamentalism. I tell people that my books are part of my full anesthesia services. I'm an anesthesiologist. And if ever that were true, this is an example of it. It's hard-hitting, but it's pretty dry read. I have some other books, and I notice they stock them in there. I'm not here to plug these things. The one I told them that I hope that they would maybe look at is this one on light. It's not light reading at all, but I collected some really good ideas that I think this group might like to look at. But the veil and trials are kind of an eternal perspective of these things. But I also wrote these two books, and Scott mentioned that. I also have a website, MormonFundamentalism.com, that I kind of wish Fair would link to. It's been up for many years. But what and I'd have some problems with this because I try to write as objectively as I can. Maybe that's the issue. But I get about half of the emails wanting to join the Mormon fundamentalists. So I've had to go in and doctor up the first sentence or two, but it still happens. So. But what I found is in all of this research and discussion that over half of the questions that people would ask me had to do with Joseph Smith's polygamy. Didn't know the answer. I tell them that book's not been written yet. But I have my own questions, and so I dove back in to doing some research and hired a research assistant, and he bogged over 1,500 hours going around finding every document that we could find, either transcribing it or getting me a copy that had to do with Joseph Smith's polygamy, and I'm putting them together into 2 volumes. It'll be out early next year. It'll be an exhaustive look at Joseph Smith's polygamy. It'll be over 1,200 pages between the 2 volumes, and there'll be new things for everybody. And I'm here to share just a few of the things that we've observed here. I also have a website, and it's josephsmithpolygamy.com. I uploaded this a couple of months ago. I did it myself, so it's kind of homegrown. Please forgive that. But there's a lot of good information here. In fact, most of what I'm going to tell you today is on this website, and there's some good research tools up there, too. If you want to go there, I pick up the mail at MormonFundamentalism.com. If you have concerns or questions or other things, go ahead and email me there. Now, the question comes up, why did Joseph Smith practice close marriage? And there's 3 different places we could go for answers. We can go to the naturalists like Fawn, Brodie, and the cynics, which are kind of in the same route. We can go to LDS apologists who gave us their own set of reasons, and then we can go to Joseph Smith himself. And I'd like to look at these 3 sources. And the first source is the naturalist. And what I mean by that is somebody who is sure God's not involved. Okay, it's all natural processes, hormones, libido, tulip 1 and 6. That's what's driving polygamy. That's their answer. And Fawn Brodie kind of codified this idea in the 1945 biography, which unfortunately is still probably the most influential book ever written on Joseph Smith. And she totally botched the treatment of his sexuality in polygamy. And she didn't even want to get it right. That's my frustration. I think that the purest naturalistic view is found in George D. Smith's 2008 novel Polygamy. We called it Celestial Marriage. I doubt there will ever be a pure naturalistic view written of Joseph Smith's polygamy. The naturalistic view of Joseph Smith's polygamy reflects a number of important weaknesses, 5 of them that we're going to talk about today. First, I will assert that credible evidence supporting their view, the naturalistic view, is lacking. Now, that's a bold statement. But as I went through, don't worry, you're really not supposed to be able to read this, okay? But as I went through, you can read them on the website. They're all there. But what I have done is read hundreds and hundreds of narratives and accounts and accusations against Joseph Smith alleging sexual propriety. And this is a group of about 100. And if you can see here that the far left column is the year, then you have the accuser, the accusation, exactly as it appeared in the rightful document, and then the reference. And these are accusations that are too generalized to really be analyzed. Could this be true? But in going through hundreds of these, I found 53 specific allegations of sexual impropriety that were leveled at Joseph Smith by 26 different accusers. This is the evidence the naturalist will use to support his or her position. And you can see this on the website, and you can almost read it here. I lost the color. But along the left side are all 53 accusations. You can click on them. The exact quote is there. It's undoctored. I haven't pulled any punches. It's exactly the way it appears in the original document. And then you can read some of the discussion. You can also click on the accuser and find out a little bit about their background as well. There are 4 categories of accusations of sexual impropriety at Joseph Smith. Sex with non-wives, polyandrous sexuality, and this is one wife with 2 husbands, and she's sleeping with both of them during the same period. That's polyandry. There is a 3rd category, the improper proposal, 16 of those, and then 4 concerning Fanny Alger. Was that adultery or was that a plural marriage? But you can go there and you can make your own assessments. I'd like to make 6 observations of those 53 accusations. 1, only 6 of the 53 accusations were published during the prophet's lifetime. There's one in 1834, and it's a second-hand accusation of an attempted seduction in a paragraph with blatant falsehoods that nobody repeated throughout the rest of the 1830s. Okay, not real credible. But that's the only published accusation of sexual impropriety against Joseph Smith published before 1842. And then there are 5 by John Bennett. Okay. This is significant because the Tanners, some of you are familiar with them, they wrote the charge of sexual immorality was probably one of the most frequent charges made against Joseph Smith. This is not supported. I would invite the Tanners to produce some evidence to support this allegation. We do have some rumors in Kirtland in 1837-38 dealing with Fanny Alger. None of them were picked up by the local papers, which tells you it was somewhat limited. Beyond those 2, the 1834 that I mentioned and these rumors in 1837, there is nothing to support this claim. There are multiple evidences that show that John C. Bennett was not a polygamy insider. And I'm getting pushed back on this from all different quarters, even church historians, but I'm going to hold my course. There is compelling evidence this guy was never once in Joseph Smith's presence learning about polygamy. And so when you factor out all of his accusations and nonsense, a much more cohesive and believable story of Joseph Smith's Nauvoo introduction to plural marriage emerges. Now, the second observation of these 53 accusations is that most of the accusers leveled their charges years or even decades after Joseph Smith's death. They were not participants. Joseph Smith was CO to, I believe, 34 women. Okay, Compton's 33 plus 1 more that Michael Marquardt found. How many complaints do we have from those wives? 0. Okay, the people who were participating in Joseph Smith's polygamy are not complaining about it, even years later. A third is that, with one exception from the controversial Bennett, all of the accusations are at least secondhand, and some are third-hand, and some are so far removed a good scholar wouldn't even use them. But that wouldn't deter the anti-Mormon. No woman left a record stating literally or in content, Joseph Smith seduced me to have sexual relations with him. A 4th observation is that in every case, contradictory evidence is available, providing an opposing view to the given allegation, and that's in the discussions with each of these on the website. I believe that the contradictory evidence is far more compelling, but you can go there and make your own judgment. And then lastly, most of the accusations contained remarkably implausible claims. So you can go and look at these, and when I uploaded these a couple of months ago, before I did it, I was worried, because you've got 53 documented accusations against Joseph Smith that some anti-Mormon could come along and extract and line up as one of the best anti-Mormon pamphlets you've ever seen. And it'll happen. You watch, and somebody's going to do it. So I went to one of my friends, the senior archivist with the church historian's office, and I said, should we do this? Is this a good thing? And he said, yeah, we're not afraid of these things. Let's show that we can talk about them. Let's get the evidence out there. But I worried that somebody in the past may have even extracted some of these accusations and lined it up as documented history, and in fact, it has happened. I don't want to be too hard on Richard Van Wagner, who wrote Mormon Polygamy, a history. Richard was the first person to attempt to write a chronological history of Mormon polygamy. And he did some good research. But the way he deals with Joseph Smith's period, polygamy, is very problematic, in my view. And for example, if we look at the 1832 to 1835 period, we find that he talks about rumors and stories, okay? But he doesn't tell us whether these rumors and stories are credible. He doesn't contextualize them. He doesn't analyze them. He just tells us there's rumors and stories. And then he quotes three of them, one that was written in 1884, one in 1889, and the other in 1886. Very late accounts, but he doesn't really tell us that. He just lines them up chronologically according to when he thought they happened, and he presents it to the reader as documented history. To me, this is problematic. So I will leave these things for you to go to, and you can decide for yourself whether there's any real credible support for the naturalistic view. The second criticism I have of the naturalistic interpretation is that it ignores Joseph Smith's theology. Is that Joseph Smith's theology, as it unfolded, his history was intertwined with it. They went hand in hand. His theology was expansive, and his history followed right along. But by throwing away and ignoring his theology, authors can take his history any direction that they want. Now, in defense of the historians, they seek to explicate historical events, leaving theology to the theologians. We understand that. But I would argue that ignoring Joseph Smith's theology at best creates incomplete histories, and at worst, inaccurate histories. Now, a fourth problem with it is that the Latter-day Saints, I argue, would have detected Joseph Smith's alleged hypocrisy if he were doing all the things the naturalists say that he was doing. And I want to address one issue. This is the naturalist historian. He wrote, "One cannot ignore Smith's capacity to deceive." One of the clearest evidences of this is his repeated public denial during the early 1840s of his own and others' plural marriages. And the antagonist and the naturalist get so much mileage out of this one issue that I want to mention it here. They don't contextualize what was going on. See, Joseph Smith was facing three conflicting commandments. Not to bear false witness, don't buy. Second, to do missionary work in temple building. And three, to practice plural marriage. He couldn't do all three. If he openly practiced plural marriage, he'd be put in jail along with the other polygamists. There'd be no missionary work, temple building, or polygamy for that matter. And so what he did is he used carefully worded denials to publicly feign obedience to the law of the land, even though he was privately disobeying a law of the land. But I argue that there is no justification for believing that Joseph publicly feigned obedience to God's laws while privately disobeying God's laws. To allege that Joseph Smith privately disobeyed his public doctrinal teachings requires specific evidence beyond a single issue of polygamy denial. But also I believe that if Joseph had behaved as hypocritically as the naturalists assert, I believe that Latter-day Saints like Brigham Young, John Taylor, Eliza Snow, and Zina Huntington would have exposed him. When I was young, I grew up in Logan, and I used to love to go to Aggie basketball. And we go up to the field house, but I used to hate it at the end of the game if it was a close game because all the adults would stand up and I couldn't. But I learned very quickly that I could tell how the Aggies were doing by watching those who were watching the Aggies. If they were cheering and shouting, we were winning. If they were sad and quiet or booing, and yeah, you boo up there, then the Aggies were not doing so well. See, you and I cannot see what Joseph was doing, but we can see the reaction of people who were around him and who were involved. Men like Brigham Young and John Taylor, women like Eliza Snow and Zina Huntington. Fawn Brodie made this concession. She said, the best evidence of the magnetism of Mormonism, of the Mormon religion, was that it could attract men with quality of Brigham Young, whose tremendous energy and shrewd intelligence were not easily directed by any influence outside of himself. I would also argue, and this is closely related to the last criticism, is that the Latter-day Saints were not that gullible. You see, naturalists who claim that Joseph Smith was motivated strictly by libido imply that they are less gullible than the non-polygamists. In essence, what they're saying is that those Nauvoo polygamists were so doggone stupid they couldn't figure it out. But I could figure it out, says the naturalist. Now, I don't mean to be disrespectful or to misstate their position or be dramatic, but isn't that really what they're saying? That they can look back through over 100 years of history and say, I got it. He just wanted sex. But those Nauvoo polygamists that were around, they couldn't figure it out. For me, that's insufficient. The naturalist view is paradoxical. It claims that those who knew Joseph Smith best could not see, but those who know him least claim to know. George Bernard Shaw, and I didn't know till I started researching that he had anything to say about the Mormons, but he said this: nothing could be more idle, nothing more frivolous than to imagine that this polygamy had anything to do with personal licentiousness. If Joseph Smith had proposed to the Latter-day Saints that they should live licentious lives, they would have rushed upon him and probably anticipated their pious neighbors who presently shot him. And I think that's accurate. So the question comes up, if the Latter-day Saints were not that gullible, why did 29 men and 85 women join him in practicing plural marriage in Nauvoo? And these are my numbers from my research, but I think they're the most accurate. George D. Smith has some plated numbers. I think there are problems with those. But the question comes up, why did they do it? A historian, a naturalist, said this is their explanation. Smith exercised remarkable influence over his followers. He assured them that plural marriage was necessary for celestial afterlife glory, and there was an urgent need to raise up seed unto the Lord in this life, promising them a world of spiritual splendor. This caught their imagination and drove them to feats of endurance and devotion. To me, this is inadequate. This is insufficient to say that Joseph was able to catch the imaginations of over 100 men and women in Nauvoo and thousands more later, and that was what compelled them. Which brings us to the fifth criticism, that there are many charismatic or what we would call spiritual experiences that are just disregarded by the naturalist. See, Fawn Brodie had to deal with this. There were too many of them for her to ignore. She said that at an early age, Joseph Smith had what only the most gifted revivalist preachers could boast of, the talent for making men see visions. And there are accounts. Mary Elizabeth Rawlins, one of Joseph Smith's plural wives, said, I did not believe. If God told him so, why did he not come and tell me? The angel told him I should have a witness. An angel came to me. It went through me like lightning. Another of Joseph's wives said this: I felt highly insulted, and he said that if I wanted to know whether the principle was true, I could go to God and find out. Finally, as I was praying the last time, an angel of the Lord appeared to me and told me that the principle was of God and for me to accept it. So if we ask two questions of the naturalist, why did Joseph establish plural marriage? Their answer would be no. Okay, he wanted to expand his sexual opportunities. If we ask the second question, well, why did the other Nauvoo polygamists fall? Well, because Joseph was charismatic and persuasive. And he was charismatic and persuasive, he truly was. But I would argue not sufficiently to get these individuals to go along. If we were able to transport the Nauvoo polygamists here, let's say we had a time machine, and we could line up all 115 of them right front with a microphone and go and ask them these same two questions, I believe almost every one of them would answer the question, why did Joseph establish plural marriage? By saying he was a prophet restorer. And if we ask the second question, why did you go along with it? They would relate to us their spiritual convictions. There would be dreams, there would be visions, there would be angels, and then there would be testimonies that they knew Joseph was a prophet or that polygamy was a correct principle, and that is why they went along. So as we look at the naturalist view, to recap the 5 problems that we've been talking about, one, I think the credible evidence is lacking. Secondly, I think that ignoring Joseph's theology is problematic. Third, I think the saints would have detected Joseph's alleged hypocrisy. 4, I don't think the saints were that gullible. And 5th, the charismatic or spiritual experiences are disregarded. So we often want to shift gears and start talking about what the LDS apologists gave as reasons for Joseph Smith's polygamy, and some of them are kind of entertaining. The first is that women outnumbered men in the church, both at Nauvoo and in Utah. Quite honestly, the censuses don't bear this out. And I'm convinced this had nothing to do with Joseph Smith introducing plural marriage. But it's still talked about, and some church leaders have even promoted it in the 1850s and all as a reason. But it doesn't seem to be supported by the censuses of that time. A second reason, and this has been suggested by Bruce R. McConkie and John A. Wissow, was that plural marriage brought needed trials and challenges, and it certainly did. A third one is publicity value, that negative publicity is better than no publicity. Okay, I'm not sure I agree with it either, but B.H. Roberts declared this very plainly in one of his writings. A fourth one is that polygamy would solve the world's problems, that prostitution and things like that would disappear. I'm not sure that I believe that, but it was promoted by a number of authorities. Then the fifth one, that medically is very difficult to defend, is that polygamy produces healthier parents and children than monogamy. The best place to go to understand why Joseph Smith established polygamy is to go to people who remembered his teachings and to go to section 132. But I wanted to make one comment that Joseph Smith himself related that he was visited by an angel with a sword who commanded him to do this. And I actually have an article coming out in Mormon Historical Studies. I don't know if you're aware of this. It's a quarterly edited by a BYU professor, and it's very good, Mormon Historical Studies, but it'll be out in the next issue or the one after that. But I found 20 accounts that talk about the angel and the sword by 9 individuals who knew Joseph Smith. The accounts are not contemporary, but the individuals knew him. And it talks about that they're actually quite interesting, and one of them says that Joseph pled with the angel. Even got the Book of Mormon out and showed him Jacob 2 that says polygamy should not be practiced. But I recommend that article to you. It'll be out in the next few months. But Joseph also gave 3 other reasons why plural marriage needed to be practiced by the Latter-day Saints. And the first one was that Old Testament polygamy needed to be restored as part of the restitution of all things, down in Acts 3:21. And if somebody comes up to you and says, why did Joseph do this? This is the answer we give up. It's easy. If they're believing in the Bible, it's even easier because Jacob and Abraham are clearly men of God, and they were polygamists. And you could just say, they did, Joseph restored it. End of discussion. Now, if you want to get into the other 2 reasons, you're going to have to explain some theology that most individuals are not going to believe. The second reason that Joseph talked about was that plural marriage creates more faithful families for noble premortal spirits to come to earth. And as you know, and there's probably people in this audience who know a lot more about this than I do, but one of the unique teachings of our religion is that we lived before we came here for thousands of ages, perhaps millions of years, as spirit children of heavenly parents, and there we had identity, we had agency, and we had a spirit body. That's a unique teaching among the major religions of this world. And then we also underwent something of a probationary state there, and there were noble and great spirits. And this teaching was that they needed faithful families to come into on earth, and polygamy allowed for more of that. Now, the third teaching that Joseph Smith gave is down in section 132 and in a few other places. And it is simply that all exalted beings must be sealed to an eternal spouse. Now, you've all seen diagrams similar to this. You've probably written up your own. Okay, this is mine. And it just shows that we start life in the pre-royal world as spirit children. We go to a probationary state, and then there's the judgment. And those that go to the celestial kingdom and the terrestrial kingdom remain separately and singly, without exaltation, in their saved condition to all eternity. And then those couples who have been sealed, for eternity in a horizontal sealing by using the sealing keys, go to the celestial glory where they progress in advance until they become exalted husbands and wives and eventually become heavenly parents and enjoy a continuation of the seeds or heavenly children in the next life. The problem is that if there's more worthy women than men, and apparently they knew this would be the case, and Brigham Young taught that was so, that some of the women would not be exalted without plural marriage. It would look like this. They would be worthy of exaltation, but if monogamy were the only marital pattern in heaven, they would not have anybody to be sealed to. And so with polygyny, which is one husband, several wives, a form of polygamy, they are able to be exalted. And you can see there's probably not going to be enough extra women to make every man a polygamist, but certainly some of them are going to need to be polygamists in the next slide. Now, what's interesting is to notice that if Joseph Smith simply wanted more sex, it's curious that he devised such a complex theology to justify the practice. You see, there was no need for a theology to justify polygamy, because there's no theology of polygamy in the Old Testament. All he had to say was, they did it, I'm restoring it, I'm doing it. End of discussion. There could have been no criticism because there was no reason given in the Old Testament for monogamy, polygamy. There's no discussion about these things. No discussion about a marriage in the Old Testament. And so Joseph Smith could have very easily just said, hey, Abraham was a prophet, had more than one wife, I'm restoring that practice, let's be on with it. But that's not what Joseph Smith did. And this is a kind of elaborated, and these are not on the website. You're going to have to buy volume 2 of my books to get these diagnosed, unless Gare posts them, maybe they'll have them up. But if you'll look at this entire process, this shows the vertical ceilings from Adam to, it's not working, from Adam to Noah down to the last generations. And through polygamy, single women can be sealed into this chain. It's a vertical chain. Starts with Adam, ends with the last generation, and then these single women who are worthy can be sealed into that so that they can be exalted. Okay? But as you can see from this diagram, the plural marriage constitutes just one small component of Joseph Smith's theology. Without plural marriage, billions of couples could be exalted. But we need plural marriage as this element, as this component of the theology in order to allow these single women to be part of exaltation. This is one eternal round. You've heard that saying. It's in the Book of Mormon in the Doctrine and Covenants. It's not a Christian term. It's not in the Bible. Okay, they would probably call it blasphemy. But that's what we see here. I'd had naturalist historians tell me that they think plural marriage is Joseph's pinnacle teaching. And it works to the naturalists very much because they're convinced Joseph just is empowered by libido. So what they're saying is that Joseph's pinnacle doctrine is driven by a desire for sex. See, it works perfectly in their reconstructions. But when they tell me that, and when this guy told me, I just says, well, based on what? Why do you think polygamy is his pinnacle doctrine? If we look at the theology, it's eternal seeds. And this is what Brigham Young taught. It's the thread that allows this to go around and around, couples being sealed, parents and children being sealed, and around it goes generation to generation. My attempt to read every known document referring to Joseph Smith's polygamy has generated a greater love and appreciation for him as a prophet. I believe the scary thing about Joseph Smith's polygamy is not Joseph Smith, not his choices and behaviors. I believe the scary thing about Joseph Smith's polygamy is simply polygamy, because he lived it and he restored it as part of a grand theology of exaltation, worlds without end.
Yep.
I was a little shorter. It was longer. I actually cut a little bit of it. But you'll get so much in it if you buy my books. You won't feel bad at all. Our failure as a church to address our polygamous past is problematic. Elder Ballard in the July Ensign says, "Don't touch plural marriage. It was a practice and irrelevant to any sharing of the gospel." They don't defend it or use the patriarchal argument to justify. Contemporary said celestial marriage was Joseph Smith's most important doctrine was his most important doctrine, and I talked about that. Do you think our failure to address plural marriage as a standing law today? Excellent question. But the one thing that we all need to recognize, and the anti-Mormons don't get it at all, and that is that polygamy is meat. It's gospel meat. Section 19 says if you get meat to the milk drinkers, they're going to choke. I'm an anesthesiologist, and more than once I've been called into the operating room to give an anesthetic to somebody with meat in their throat. And if it gets into their trachea, boy, we've got a real emergency on our hands. And the analogy holds totally true. Polygamy's tough. I envy Ron Esplin. He's the editor for the Joseph Smith Papers Project, because he says very honestly that they're not trying to defend Joseph. They just want you to get to know him better through his papers. And he's confident, Ron says, that Joseph Smith will do just fine. And I'm confident too. And then I feel kind of the same way, that the more we get to know about Joseph Smith's polygamy, the better off he looks. But the problem is it's gospel meat. It's tough. And in this sexually saturated society that we live in, there's only one way to understand it, and that's it's driven by sex. And the only way to understand it otherwise is to already, almost before you go into it, have a very strong testimony that Joseph Smith was a prophet. hopefully by getting these new things out there, we can allow at least some talking, but I don't think it'll ever be discussed in gospel doctrine. I'm not sure that it ever should be, because there's going to be some milk drinker out there that's going to be confused. And I believe that if you got a room of 100 people, 99 can handle meat, one can handle needs milk, the Spirit will only inspire the speaker to teach milk. And that's what we get over and over in our lessons. So if you're going to want the meat, you're going to have to look for it in other places. I think this is a great venue, okay? And I applaud FAIR for putting it together. And I'm spending too long on that one question, right? We can't assume there are going to be extra women. What happens if there are more exalted men? And this is a good question. People ask it all the time. God cannot control what happens at the end of the earth, because that would be controlling our agency. But he can predict. And I would guess, well, he obviously knew on this earth, and bringing me on top of this very plainly, that there would be an excess of women. The idea of polyandry Trinity is insoluble so far as any of the doctrines that we have. It just couldn't happen. And so you can speculate how you want, have at it. But to say that we can't assume that, I think, is not accurate, because Brigham said it was going to happen, and it's implied all the way through section 132. Not the best answer, but that's the best I could come up with.
Can you read that one? I need my glasses.
Spiritual wager.
Oh, good question. Spiritual wifely. This is a term that was used even before the saints went to Nauvoo. It was a label applied to any religious group that was doing something other than monogamy. Okay. Joseph Smith only used the term once, so far as we have any record, and it was in derision. He's making fun of it. Okay, he did not use the term. When John Bennett says that Joseph was wanting a spiritual wife, this is all fabrication, I argue. There's no evidence that Joseph ever introduced plural marriage using the term spiritual wifely or anything close to it. It was celestial marriage, patriarchal marriage, eternal marriage. And this is a place that hopefully my books will clarify some of this stuff, that we need. Spiritual wifery was not something that Joseph ever taught. It was adopted, however, by some of his plural wives. It was Emily Partridge, or was it Helmar Kimball, used it in one of her books and things. So the saints adopted it later on. But in Nauvoo, Joseph did not use it except in derision. If polygamy is necessary for single righteous women to be exalted, why are we not practicing it today? What? I mean, I saw a bumper statement the other day. It said, the punishment for polygamy is 2 wives. But quite honestly, one of the hard questions to answer, in fact, it may be the only question that I can't adequately get an answer for myself, is why did God command Joseph and the saints to do it in Nauvoo? I mean, permitting it was necessary theologically. I hopefully was able to offer that as a possibility. But why God commanded it, I don't have a real good answer. I got, some possibilities. And so if I can't answer then, I don't think there's a need for it today. The millennium will be a time for all of these sealings to be taken care of. Vertical sealings of parents to children, horizontal sealings of husbands and wives. By the end of the millennium, I believe it's all going to be sorted out using the sealing authority. Please address claims of Joseph Smith's. Oh, yeah. Thomas Gray. Please address claim of Joseph Smith's marriage to 11 already married women. Sexual polyandry is something that has been, Fawn Brodie said it was for sure happening with Joseph Smith. My position is that it never happened with Joseph Smith, and that the best evidence shows that that is the case. It's something that we're only in round 1 on this. George D. Smith and I are going back and forth because he's sure that it happened and said I'm using proof text, and I'm sure that it didn't happen. I assert he's using tabloid level evidences and assumption to get to it. But we've also found some new things, supersede Todd Compton's discussion of Sylvia Lyon, which places a whole different timeline on it, and that's really the only case with any good evidence, and his timeline is very problematic. Joseph Smith taught, and this is something that the naturalists just ignore, Joseph taught that sexual polyandry was adultery and the woman should be destroyed, section 132, verse 63. And yet the naturalists portray him as this practicing sexual polyandry, and nobody's saying bull about it. He's this arch hypocrite, and nobody's seems to care at all. To me, that's problematic, not adequate in explaining what's going on. More specifically, though, in my book, I've got 4 chapters. I've got a brief recap on the website. It's a very complicated topic. And you have to almost look at all I found 13 women who had legal husbands at the same time they were sealed to Joseph Smith. I go through and analyze all 13 because I don't think they represent one phenomenon. I think 6 of them were eternity-only sealings, and despite what Quinn and Compton have said, there's very good evidence that at least one eternity-only sealing occurred, and there's no reason to believe that others didn't occur as well. So don't believe that notion that there were none. Yes, we found some new. Don Bradley found it. It's in the Andrew Jensen papers. And that's probably all that I can tell on this without really, it's a whole lecture on itself, maybe 2 or 3. But I believe, and I say I'm willing to go the distance on this, he did not practice sexual polyandry. And I think we're going to be able to persuade the majority of people that that is so. There's also an article in the book, an article that I've written in the book by Craig Foster and Bill Brehurst by John Whitmer's Historical Association. It'll be out, I think, next year. September? That close. Whoa. Yeah. Anyway, that talks about it. It gives some more detail. Is it a coincidence your diagram of the celestial and terrestrial kingdoms is shaped like a map of Utah? I hadn't even noticed that. I did it at Corel Draw, and I'm not very good at that program, but I don't think so. Here. If I was inspired, what spirit was it that inspired me? I do have a degree from the University of Utah, but critics argue that Old Testament prophets were only allowed by God to practice plural marriage. That, in fact, God frowned upon the practice. How do I respond? Yeah, I've been going through the theology edits. Lloyd Erickson is my editor for that volume. Levina Fielding Anderson is editing volume 1. And if you ask a Christian about polygamy, they just get starting to squirm like this because they can't deny that Abraham was a friend of God and a great prophet, and they also can't deny that he was a polygamist. And usually what they'll do is they'll say, well, God winked at it. He didn't really like it, but he let him do it, and they should have done it. And then most of the time, it was mostly lost later on in the law of Moses. It was mostly discouraged. And then the other thing they do is they observe how much problems it caused, between Sarah and Hagar and Elkanah and his wife Hannah, and I forget the other one. There's just, it's hard. How much live that way on earth? Polygamy's tough because what it does is it expands the husband's sexual and emotional opportunities, okay? At the same time, it fractionates the wife's. You can't call that fair. To me, it's very sexist. It's very unfair on earth. Okay, I assume the idea is how it might be in heaven, that all of those problems might be resolved. But here on earth, I don't know how you can defend this as being fair. So this is why I don't think that we would want to practice it. There is no evidence that God frowned on its practice. None at all. He gave David, through Nathan, David's wives. There's no, he approved of it. And this is just Christians doing a little dance because they're uncomfortable with it. It's a very difficult one for them to kind of get around if they want to condemn polygamy and yet accept Abraham as prophet. The angels in the celestial kingdom are sealed and not sealed for eternity. They didn't go to the celestial and terrestrial kingdoms. Yeah, I didn't include that caveat in the diagram just for complex reasons. There will be celestial beings who are sealed. Yeah. And we don't understand the dynamics of it. We only have, I think, one single reference, and I think it's Clayton's journal, that there are 3 sections to the celestial kingdom. And Joseph said to get that top section, you got to be sealed. And beyond that, I don't think we have anything for anybody. I've searched. If you have something, share it with me. I'd love to see it. Any idea why Joseph engaged in polyandry with our stress on the sanctity of the marriage? Did any Joseph's inner circle practice polyandry? Yeah, my position is, and we need to understand, and Todd Compton did a great work. Now, I'm standing on his shoulders with our research, and there'll be others come stand on my shoulders. That's just how this works. But the one problem that he introduced with polyandry was he defined marriage as anything that has ceremony. So you could show that a woman has a legal ceremony, and that she has a religious ceremony, and she is ceremonially a polyandrist, But it doesn't see anything about sexual polyandry. See, Joseph Smith theology, ceremonial polyandry wasn't that big of a deal because, their marriages were ended much more freely than they are today back in that time. Getting a divorce sometimes required you to go to the state legislature. And in Nauvoo, they had to go over to Carthage to the circuit court, which only came around every so often. That was the only way to get a divorce. A justice of the peace. And there were lots of them could make a marriage, but to unmake it was a real baby challenge. But Todd, I would argue, labeling it ceremonial polyandry just created a lot of confusion because he would document ceremonial polyandry and then the readers left to think, oh yeah, there's sexually polyandry going on here too. But he doesn't document that, which is really a difficult thing to document if you think about it. How can we document a woman sleeping with two men 150 years ago? We usually look at offspring to assume that the father is actually the father of the offspring. Very difficult thing, but scholars, historians, antagonists, naturalists are very willing to assume lots of things with this and say Joseph was involved with this. Again, my position is that sexual polyandry was adultery. This is what Joseph taught he did practice. Why did Joseph not have children with the women other than Emma, or did he? If you go to the website, I've identified two, and I shouldn't say I've identified, I mean, they're out there, people talk about them, two offspring to Joseph Smith. And this is all I think we know about. One is Josephine Fisher, Josephine Lyon Fisher, and you may have heard of her. A second one is a child born to Olive Frost. And both Olive and the child died before they left Nauvoo, so I don't even know the gender. But also, if you go to the website, I got 17 other alleged offspring to Joseph Smith. I don't think any of them are real. Some of them have been disproven by DNA testing, by Hugo Parado's done some great work. And others of them, there's just no evidence to support it, and there's contradictory evidence. But I do believe that he fathered two, and there's references perhaps to a third, children. And this is evidence that even though Joseph had 34 wives, and we do have evidence of sexual relations in 9 of those cases, it's good evidence, with some ambiguous evidence in 5 more. But he wasn't involved with the polyandrous wives, which were 13, I believe. That I would also argue that there's not a lot of sexual relations going on anyway, or we would have had more offspring. And when the RLDS missionaries came out to Utah in 1866 and 69 and 75, the Latter-day Saints were wanting to put right in their face that Joseph was a polygamist, because David and Alexander, they didn't think their dad was, and they eventually, I think, came to know that he was. I think Joseph Smith III knew right from the beginning. But they would have, I think, the leaders of the church, Brigham Young and others, would have paraded some of these children to these two RLDS missionaries, showing them, yeah, these are your half-brothers, half-sisters, if they had known about it. And the fact that we don't have much offspring is very good evidence that Joseph isn't finding time to be with these plural wives. And it's no surprise. Emma Smith accepted polygamy for a few weeks, the end of May, first part of June, and then for a month or two in September and October, and that's it. The rest of the time, she was on the workout against polygamy. And she had spies out. She confronted Joseph's wife. She took a watch from one of them and stamped it in the dirt. I mean, she was aggressive. And don't judge him, okay? We don't judge her.
She had a really tough place, and my heart goes out to her.
Sorry. But Emma was watching, and for Joseph to sneak away of you with one of his plural wives was not going to be a common occurrence. There were lawmen, there were unbelievers, and there were people wanting to condemn Joseph for his polygamy, who were watching him. So I don't think he was having a lot of sexual relations. And of course, there's these sensualized claims that he had a harem and these types of things. Not supportive.
How do you handle the question today of why we lived it
in early church history? I think I've kind of addressed that. There's good theology that we needed it, but I don't know why God commanded it. And if you've got some good ideas, share them with me if you would. As a former church curriculum writer, I can say that we have requested not to write on polygamy, especially favorably because of the 30,000 people who practice it today. We were not to indirectly promote their cause. My first introduction, as has been mentioned, was to Mormon fundamentalist polygamy. And I had tried to read everything there is in Nauvoo polygamy. And I can tell you even more strongly, these Mormon fundamentalists, and there's sure a lot of good ones out there. I've met lots of my friends with some of them. They're totally in error. Two evidences that their lines of authority are nonsensical. Lauren Woolley had no authority. He was a storyteller. Their line of authority is very problematic. And I believe the one verse that was given for the Mormon fundamentalists in section 132 is verse 18. It says that if a man marry a wife and make a covenant with her for time and all eternity, if that covenant is not by me or by my word, which is my vow, and is not sealed through him who is anointed and appointed unto this power, then it is not valid, neither of force when they are out of the world, because they are not joined by me. When they are out of the world, it cannot be received there, because the angels and gods are there. And now I'm messing up, but you get the idea that you have to have the authority of the one man. They don't have it. Across the board, 100%. Their sincerity, their traditions, their burning bosoms cannot jump that lapse, that loss of authority. And then the second thing I would just offer for thought is that the one man who holds the keys of sealing also holds the keys of the gathering of Israel. How many missionaries did the fundamentalist leaders send out to gather Israel? Okay, see, the fundamentalist leader said, I had the keys of sealing, so he also has keys of the gathering of Israel. How many missionaries did John Woolley send out? 0. Lauren Warren, 0. And John J. Leslie Broadbent, 0. I can go down the line. See, how can you hold these keys and not use them? So anyway, when it comes to the fundamentalists, and I like I say, there's a lot of good ones. There's some eccentrics out there too, but most of them are very sincere that they have no authority, and their marriages are not valid, in my view. Sealing is required for exaltation. How about those who have no attraction for the opposite sex? Well, that's an easy question, isn't it? I've written a manuscript on homosexuality and the restored gospel. And I was prompted to do this. It was after I read the fundamentalist big one, and I had some time there before I started on this Joseph Smith stuff. Had been published. But I studied this topic a little bit because there were people saying, look, we got monogamy, we got polygamy, why not same-sex marriage? But I can never figure out how same-sex marriage could fit into the theology. I just couldn't find a place. And I gave a lecture at Sunstone last year on the eternal patriarchal order, and I used some of these same diagrams you saw here on the theology. And afterwards, an elderly same-sex couple came up to me, and they said, I can see from what you said that there really isn't any place in all of this for same-sex marriage in the next life. And I said, well, that's my conclusion. I'm not here to judge you, but that's my conclusion as well. And he says, I think I got it figured out. I think that all of those, the homosexuals in the next life, all go to the gay celestial kingdom where they have the best clothing and the best decorations and the best food of all. And he was sincere, and I was grateful that he come up and talk to me, because I don't want to offend anybody with what I had said, but I think the theology shows that there's problems with the idea that God made anybody homosexual. Certainly there are some with same-sex attraction, no doubt of that, but in our theology they have to deal with that, because the only authorized sexual outlet is heterosexual lawful marriage, lawful according to God's laws. It's a toughie, especially for family members of individuals who had declared themselves as being homosexual. No easy answers here. It's really a toughie. Do I have time to one more?
Spouse to bring him on.
Anyway, thank you so much.